For most of my lifetime, the right to vote was expanding, especially during the heyday of the civil rights movement. It seemed only natural to me, part of the great promise of America. But that crucially important democratic advance has been stopped in its tracks, replaced by a deliberate, concerted effort to suppress the right of millions of American citizens to vote for the candidates of their choice. We'll talk about this with my guest, Wendy Weiser, Director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law here in New York. Wendy, welcome. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
So we've seen voter suppression efforts actually for quite a while, but this latest push really got going in high gear back around 2010, 2011. Walk us through what happened and what's been going on since then.
I date the beginning of this new push to cut back on voting actually at Florida 2000, when the country saw for the first time, or first time in a while, that the rules of election administration can be manipulated and can have an effect on outcomes of contested elections.
Right.
But it was in 2010 when that realization came to fruition in a real push to cut back on voting rights across the country. In the period before the 2012 election, from 2011 to 2012, we saw 181 pieces of legislation to cut back on voting. In the end, 19 states passed laws that year that made it harder for eligible Americans to participate in the process. And that has continued through to the present day.
Now, the Supreme Court last year did a real number on the Voting Rights Act. It gutted important protections for minority voters. Has there been a long enough time to see what the impact of that has been?
You know, a year is a short time to assess the impact, but there was really an immediate impact from the loss of this crucial protection of the Voting Rights Act. On the same day the Supreme Court announced a decision, or immediately afterwards, 4 states announced their intentions to move forward with restrictive voting measures that would have, or in some cases already had been blocked under the Voting Rights Act, and that's Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, and North Carolina, which actually passed the most restrictive piece of voting legislation that we've seen in decades and decades. And that happened almost immediately right after the Shelby County decision. We didn't only see a step up in efforts to make it harder to vote in those states that were previously covered. We've also seen we've lost a crucial protection in the courts. In the lead up to the 2012 election, and even currently, the courts have been a real important bulwark protecting the right to vote, and many of the most restrictive laws were actually blocked or postponed in advance of the 2012 election. Many of those were under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. That protection is now gone, and Texas is a very good example. It passed what is, one of the now 3 most restrictive voter ID laws in the country that really narrowly targeted certain forms of IDs that large percentages of Americans didn't have, and that a court found was discriminatory under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and it was blocked. Immediately after the Shelby County decision, that statute was put in effect. It is being litigated now. It's being challenged, but right now voters are, functioning under that requirement. They have to show ID that a court found was discriminatory under the law.
Now, it's hard to make the case that this whole issue is about anything other than partisanship and race. I mean, it's the states with huge Democratic turnouts, with big African American turnouts, that we're seeing the big push to restrict voting. Is there any other legitimate way to look at this?
The data confirm that partisanship and race are the biggest drivers of these efforts. From the partisanship perspective, in 18 of the 22 states that passed laws making it harder to vote between 2010 and 2014 were completely controlled by Republican bodies. There were 2 that were in that were just not as restrictive, and there was 1 that was passed by ballot initiative, but otherwise it was exclusively Republican-controlled bodies. And so that was, partisanship is a critical factor. Race has also been strongly tied to these efforts. In There was actually a recent study by the University of Massachusetts at Boston, professors, political scientists, that found that the more likely, the higher the increase in African American turnout, the more likely the state was to introduce or to pass restrictive voting legislation. And when you look at those numbers, they're borne out. Of the 11 states with the highest African American turnout in 2008, 7 of them will have now new restrictions in place that they didn't before. Of the 12 states with the highest increase in Hispanic population growth, we have 9 that passed laws that are making it harder to vote. And of the states that were formerly covered by the Voting Rights Act because of their history of discrimination, 2/3 of them have laws currently in place that they didn't have before that will make it harder to vote. So it's very hard to escape the conclusions that partisanship and race are critical factors in this movement.
So for conservative Republicans, they're facing sort of a real uphill fight when you look at the demographic landscape. So you're getting voters that are, after a while, will be significantly younger, will be darker skinned. And one of the ways of sort of offsetting that disadvantage, because these are voters who have tended to vote Democratic, is voter suppression. Since we've seen this, across much of the country, have you guys encountered any evidence that this, you don't have to be wildly conspiratorial, but I mean, have you seen any evidence of real nationwide organization driving this voter suppression?
It's hard to prove what that, and to uncover the intent behind a legislative movement. So in some cases, on the voter ID front, there was a conservative organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, that was involved in helping push the voter ID legislation, the restrictive photo ID laws that were being put in place. But there have been a range of other restrictions, and it's hard to know who was driving it, but the impact is very clear. It is targeting states that have huge increases in African American turnout and Hispanic population growth. It's making it harder for everybody to vote, but it does make it it impacts certain groups far more than others. If you look at the restrictive photo ID laws, while 11% of Americans don't have the IDs that are required by those laws, 25% of African Americans don't have those IDs. So they certainly do impact some groups more than others. But again, they do impact everybody. This is something that everybody should care about. Elections should be free, fair, and accessible to all. Right. Equally accessible to all, but this is something that doesn't only impact people who are minority voters or are in or in states that, in those states.
Now, the proponents, of course, will say that they're trying to stop voter fraud. So take photo ID, for example. Is there any evidence that there is any significant amount of voter fraud with people using, false IDs, IDs of people who are, people who are not them, or made-up identities? Is there much evidence of that?
We do have a lot of protections in place and a lot to prevent that from happening, and they're very effective. We have, no significant problems been uncovered anywhere, and in fact, in most of these places, they can't uncover a single instance of proven impersonation voter fraud. We should all be against voter fraud and want to make sure that we have adequate protections in place. But what we shouldn't do is, in the name of guarding against something that we should be guarding against, pass measures that keep millions of eligible citizens from actually being able to participate.
So it's not just voter ID. In these states that pass these restrictions, what they want are specific government-issued voter identification. And you mentioned the number of people who don't have that kind of ID. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the studies show, and certainly a survey that the Brennan Center shows, that 11% of eligible citizens don't have government-issued photo IDs, and that's been confirmed by multiple studies. And there are some groups of citizens that are even more likely not to have those IDs. Older voters, 18% of them don't have government-issued photo IDs. As I mentioned, African Americans, it's up to a quarter. Veterans are also especially impacted by this. Students, younger voters between 18 and 24, 18% of them don't have government-issued photo IDs. So some groups really, do feel the impact more, but it's 11% of Americans across the board don't have IDs that would meet the requirements of these new laws in many states.
There are also states who have passed laws requiring proof of citizenship before voting. So there, I guess you need a birth certificate or a passport or maybe naturalization documents. Those kinds of documents seem particularly tough for people. What's been the experience there?
Well, there have been a few states, a handful of states that have put in place these requirements as a prerequisite to registering to vote, that somebody should have to show documentary proof of citizenship. People don't typically carry around their birth certificates or passports if they do have them. At least 7% of Americans don't have any documentary proof of citizenship readily available, according to studies that we've done. And so that has and we've seen in the states where they've already put these requirements in effect, there are tens of thousands of people who have not been able to register, who otherwise would have been able to, who there's no reason to believe that they're not eligible voters and have and aren't citizens.
These are requirements mostly for registration. You don't have to prove citizenship when you show up at the polling place.
The bills that we've seen and the new laws we've seen have targeted at the registration level, and that's actually made it much harder for people to help other people register to vote, run voter registration drives. The ways in which people register to vote are, people don't typically have citizenship documentation with them when they encounter voter registration.
And for folks who don't have passports, I mean, birth certificates can be hard to access sometimes. It's not that easy.
And they can be expensive, and that's actually one of the complicating facts of some of the new ID requirements. Is in order to obtain an ID that is required to vote, you actually need to have a birth certificate and a range of other identification that costs money to get, and that might take a lot of effort to get. And so there's a lot of logistical and financial costs involved. These are hurdles that have not been taken into account in these new laws. There are other jurisdictions that have come up with ID requirements that don't impose those hurdles on people. In these new laws that have been really, targeting, that appear to be, targeting voters to make it harder to vote, those are not at all alleviated.
One of the things I found interesting was the restrictions that are being placed on early voting. Now, Barack Obama back in 2008 did a terrific job for him on getting voters to the polls early. Early voting has also been one of the major ways of getting African Americans to the polls, especially on Sunday voting. So folks will go to church and then they'll go straight from church to the voting booths. And some of these early voting restrictions actually target Sunday voting. So talk about this early voting problem.
So before 2008, early voting was a very popular reform, both among Democrats and Republicans. And in 2008, there was a big push, especially by the Obama campaign, to drive early voting efforts. And there was a lot of early voting activity among African American churches, even some Latino churches on Sundays, and in states that allowed for early voting. And in many of those states, for the first time after the 2008 election, we saw efforts to cut back on early voting and to cut back on Sunday early voting. That led to a lot of controversy in Florida and was one of the contributing factors to the long lines on Election Day in Florida in 2012, according to studies. We've seen efforts just this year that are highly controversial, and in Ohio and in Wisconsin, to cut back on early voting, and particularly on the Sunday. North Carolina is another place where there were huge increases in early voting, where 23% of African Americans who voted in the election in 2008 in North Carolina voted on the Sunday, on the days that have been eliminated by that state's law.
One of the things that I think is truly weird has been the efforts to stop voter registration drives. Those are drives, I mean, you would think that any citizen would say, hey, this is great, you're encouraging people to vote, it's nonpartisan. I personally think that that's really important, whether it's Democrats or Republicans that you're signing up. But my question really is, how is that legal? Why should the government have any say about whether citizens get together and try and encourage other citizens to vote?
Well, in fact, the courts, we have been successful in the courts in pushing back on some of these laws that cut back on voter registration drives. The problem is, and I'll give Florida as an example, in the lead up to the 2000.
Goes back to Florida.
There are a number of states who have been putting this forward, but in Florida, we were successful in challenging a law that imposed fines on voter registration drives for not following particular, very impossible administrative burdens. So they didn't prohibit the voter registration drives, they just made it such that nobody would really feel safe doing voter registration drives, otherwise they would be subject to potential criminal penalties and very high fines. And so a lot of the community groups that were doing voter registration drives just stopped for fear of getting those fines imposed on them or having other penalties imposed on them. We went to court. The court actually blocked it, said that this is unconstitutional, but there was a period of 8 to 10 months during which that case was being litigated and the law was in effect, and voter registration drives were not functioning. So they got to function. It was a great victory and an affirmation of our constitutional principles, but overall voter registration went down by 14% in 2012 over the comparable period in 2008 because there was less voter registration going on. So even when you win, even when it's not legal, it still has a negative impact on the voting process. Our voter registration system just needs to be modernized. It's a travesty that we have such a high percentage of unregistered voters and that our voter rolls are so error-laden. We can really fix this with technology and modernize our voter registration system. But at the very least, we should not be cutting off access to voter registration and make the problem even worse.
So you saw a real impact on voter registration. What about this overall voter suppression effort that's been going on for a few years now? Is there any evidence that they are, in fact, preventing people from getting to the polls? Are turnouts lower? Any evidence at all?
Well, interesting they should ask. In 2014, right now, if assuming no courts step in, there will be 15 states that will have new voting restrictions in place that were not in place in 2010. Or 2012. So it will be the first federal election where they will have new voting restrictions in place. These voting restrictions have not actually, in the lead up to 2012, most of the worst restrictions were blocked or postponed by courts or otherwise repealed or pushed back by ballot initiative efforts. There was a real successful pushback against it. So we haven't seen them in place in many states for very long. In those places where we've seen restrictions in place, we've seen an impact. It's hard to, there aren't long studies that can quantify it with great certitude, but there's certainly been, tens of thousands Arizona voters who weren't able to register to vote when they first put in place their documentary proof of citizenship requirement. There were, voters who were turned away because of voter ID requirements in Texas's primary election, but there hasn't been, a full, we haven't seen the full impact of these laws yet.
Right, and we've got, an important off-year election coming up just in a few months, and then there'll be another presidential election, of course, in 2016. What are your biggest concerns with these elections facing us?
Well, as I just mentioned, there are 15 states right now that might have new voting restrictions in place if the courts don't step in. I am an optimist. I'm actually hopeful that the courts really are going to help push back against these laws. They are contrary to core American principles and to our democratic principles that infuse a lot of our constitutional and legal provisions. And the courts have actually been pushing back fairly consistently in the cases where they have reached the courts. So I'm optimistic that many of the worst of these provisions are going to be blocked, but the efforts to keep pushing continue. And as I mentioned with the Florida story and with the Texas story, even when the courts do intervene, there are people that are harmed in the interim. So that is a concern.
According to a couple of reports that you've written, all the news is not bad on the voting front. So to raise our levels of optimism here, tell us some of the positive things that are going on.
Well, on the positive side, Americans actually don't like when politicians are manipulating the rules of elections
Right.
for political gain. And there's a lot of consensus around basic reforms that would actually improve the system. In fact, after the 2012 election and the controversies in the long lines, President Obama established a bipartisan commission on election administration to make recommendations, chaired by two political leaders of the opposing parties, the lawyers for his campaign and for Mitt Romney's campaign. And they came up with a surprisingly good level, amount of recommendations that would really improve the voting process, where there's really consensus among election administrators and experts across the country. We need to improve the voter registration process, modernize voter registration, expand online registration, electronically integrate our voter registration systems so that they're error-free and seamless for voters. We need to expand early voting. Despite the fact that in some states it's being cut back as a political tool, there is a general consensus that this is a good practice, that it makes elections run smoother, that it's a good customer service for the voters, it prevents long lines. So there's real consensus around what we need to do. We also need minimum national standards around how we allocate polling place resources. That's one of the things that we haven't talked about, but we're releasing a study that shows that not only did minority voters in the 3 states that we studied wait longer in line, but they also had fewer resources in terms of voting machines or poll workers assigned to their precincts. That I don't think is a conspiracy. I think that that it's a result of a variety of decisions, but we're not deliberately planning to allocate resources in the correct way. These kind of 3 big areas are things that we can fix, and there's wide-ranging consensus across the political spectrum among experts about what needs to be done, and Americans agree. And so I'm actually hopeful that we're starting to see in the legislatures a real movement towards introducing and pushing solutions that work. People were really angry at the long lines in 2012. And if you look at 2013 and 2014, while we've seen a continued push in certain states to make it harder to vote, we actually have seen a much bigger increase in legislation to make it easier to vote and to implement some of these reforms where there's a lot of consensus around them. And if in 2013, 8 laws passed that made it harder to vote, but 10 passed to improve the voting process. And in 2014, we've seen hundreds more legislative efforts to improve the voting process than we've seen to restrict voting. So it is going in a positive direction. And I'm hopeful that with the anger that the public's showing against this shenanigans around the voting process and around the what appears to be a failure in our system, that we're going to start moving to fixing it and getting it right.
We talked about the partisan nature of voter suppression efforts. But if you were talking to people who are, let's say you were talking to conservatives or you were talking to Republicans, and you were trying to explain why all Americans should be concerned about voter suppression, why this is not a good thing, even if there is some temporary political advantage, what would you say?
I actually think that all Americans across the political spectrum agree with the proposition that elections should be free, fair, and accessible, that every eligible American should be able to vote without significant impediments in their place. And so where we've found a lot of common ground is around reforms that actually advance both make the process work better for everyone, increase access, and are very mindful of security and cost, like modernizing the voter registration system, like expanding early voting. So when you kind of turn the conversation to making the system work well for everyone, there's a surprising degree of consensus among everyone.
That's all the time we have. This has been terrific. Wendy, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Fast food workers fighting for a livable wage recently traveled to Addison, Illinois for a national conference to demonstrate their solidarity and to ratchet up the pressure on such money-making machines as McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut. What they want is a wage of $15 an hour, and they more than deserve it. Some of the top fast food CEOs are making $10 million a year or more off the labor of these hard-working, underpaid, and often poorly treated men and women. Imagine the kind of lives that the children of those CEOs have, and the kind of lives that the children of their workers have. Many of the workers serving food hour after hour in these restaurants have to resort to food stamps to feed their own families. There is a steadily growing militancy among these workers who are sick of being exploited and have won a great deal of well-deserved support from the Service Employees International Union. This is an economic justice issue of the first importance, and I greatly admire their willingness to fight. That's all for now. See you next time.